first, I think it's really important to recognize that the scriptures do say to Israel, you of all the peoples have I known. That doesn't mean that God didn't know everything about all the other peoples around the world, but it was a personal choice on God's part to enter into relationship with them. And that was primarily because they were the offspring of Abraham, who is called the friend of God. So God had entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham and his offspring. And so God could have had Abraham as the father of any people. And the problem with the Jewish people, as we see in the Gospels, is that they boasted of that and came to the conclusion eventually that they could pretty well behave and do what they wanted to do because they were the covenant people of God. And that's why Jesus said, hey, God could raise up offspring to Abraham from these rocks. Don't think you're all that special. And in fact, as I think it's Amos, it says, the reason that God chose people of Israel is not because they were more numerous or better or anything, but because God is free to choose who he wishes. And in fact, he chose a stiff-necked people. And that helped him to demonstrate his graciousness and his mercy and his long-suffering, his patience. And we learned so much from God's dealings with the people of Israel through all of that. So when we talk about election in the context of God chose Abraham and his offspring, that's a different thing than when we look at election in eternity past in Christ of a specific people, like you have in Ephesians chapter 1. And so you have an election you do have passages of election unto service, but then you clearly have passages of election unto salvation. So the children of Abraham, in one sense, are elected unto salvation because there is a sense in which only those who are of the faith of Abraham are right with God. I mean, you look at Romans chapter 4. That's the argument, is we need to have the faith that Abraham had. And that was a faith that was not dependent upon works. It was not, I'm going to try to earn my way into a relationship with God and stuff like that. And so that election in that sense would be unto salvation. But then there is simply an election of a people to function in a particular way. If you want a good example, look what happened with Pharaoh and the Egyptians. God chose to harden Pharaoh's heart. He told Moses before he ever went into Pharaoh, I'm going to harden his heart. And there's a reason. The reason was that God wanted to demonstrate his power over all the gods of Egypt. And when you study the plagues, by the way, you'll see that there were gods that were being demonstrated to be worthless and non-existent by every plague that God brought. And so God was glorifying himself in the destruction of the idols of the people of Egypt. And so you could say that there was an election of Pharaoh and his armies, but it was an election not unto salvation, but unto destruction. And that for God's glory and for our benefit in many, many years after that. So you have to be really specific as to what you're referring to when you talk about election. Predestination has a more specific use in passages such as Romans 8 or Ephesians 1. There you're no longer talking about an ethnic group. You're talking about a people in Christ Jesus. And their election is not based upon what they've done. It's not based upon God looking into the future and seeing what they would do. It's completely based upon his mercy and grace. And that is predestination unto salvation. So that's Romans 8, what's called the golden chain of redemption. Those who he foreknew. And foreknew, by the way, is is an active thing. It's not God looking down the corridors of time and seeing what somebody else is going to do. To foreknow is an active verb in the original language. It's an act of choosing to enter into relationship with. So those whom he foreknew, he predestined, called, justified, glorified. These are all things that God does, and God accomplishes perfectly.